Welcome to the Recruitment Roundtable on long-term care, where our team of savvy recruiters from an executive search firm spills the beans on the ins and outs of hiring in long-term care. Join us for candid conversations, industry insights, and a touch of humor as we explore the fascinating world of long-term care recruitment. Get ready for real talk, practical advice, and a few laughs along the way. We are three recruiters from Full Spectrum Search Group, an executive search firm highly niched in the long-term care recruiting space.
All right, everyone. Hi, Katie. Hi, Josh. How you guys doing?
Hey, Gaston.
Hey.
All right. This episode, we are going to talk about the recruiting process, really from start to finish. And I think for us, we want to talk about multiple areas of the recruiting process in terms of interviews from the candidate's perspective, from the client's perspective, and then also, funny enough, from the recruiter's perspective, because yes, we are recruiters. So I think in this episode, we want to really just deep dive and give you and the audience out there some tricks and tips on what we're going to do.
Sounds good. I'm just curious for the two of you, what is the longest interview process you've had for a candidate? Like how many for me, it was 9.
Wow.
9 interviews?
9 interviews for a director of sales.
That's wild.
Yeah. Maybe
did you end up placing them?
Yeah. Thank God.
Good for you for keeping them engaged for that long. I mean, I don't know who would hang on for that. I feel like by the time a 4th interview comes around, these days candidates are like, hey, what's going on? Do they not like me? Like, am I wasting my time here? It's like, no, like it's a corporation. Like there's a process,
Yeah.
4 interviews isn't enough.
I almost was like, hey, we got to pull out of this interview process. I don't know if I can stay the course.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can keep doing this
process. And they're like, we're going to offer 20 grand below what we said we were going to offer. Just to hope that.
I would have cried.
Wow.
I would have cried. I would have screamed. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I think for me, the longest I've had is I had 7 interviews, and 2 of those interviews, the candidate had to be flown to multiple places across the country.
Oh, wow.
And the final interview, I think, was a panel interview at the corporate office, and they ended up not getting the job. So
Ouch.
7 and 2 flights.
That is, oof.
Man, that's brutal. Yeah.
That's painful. That's painful. Why do you think, I know why people obviously interview, just because it's a team choice. You want to make sure you're finding the right candidate. It's expensive to hire, on board, all of that, expensive to recruit, you name it. But what could we be doing to, I guess, dig in a little further on details during interviews so that you can skip a couple of steps or even feel more comfortable with moving that person forward?
Yeah, I think what I've seen is clients in this climate are a little bit gun shy on who they're hiring. So because of that, it's a much more slower, methodical process. And I think I've even got a client right now that's telling me, they're starting to emulate the practice of slow to hire, quick to fire. And I think from a client's perspective, like that totally makes sense. But if you're going to operate that way, then you also have to put yourself in the candidate's shoes. You have to take yourself back and say, okay, when I was interviewing, what was that process like? And if I'm interviewing today with my current organization and I was going through our interview process, how would I feel?
Yeah.
And a lot of the times they would probably sit there and say, gosh, that's way too many interviews. So if there's a client that is doing that type of self-evaluation and they realize I probably wouldn't make it through this interview process, then they need to start combining interviews. And I think in this day and age, in terms of how accessible everyone is, getting everyone on video and not having to do things in person, which if you want to do in person, great. But if you can do stuff on a video, like right now, we've got 3 people in literally 3 different parts of the US on this Zoom. And I think a lot can get done if we combine interviews and have a panel interview.
Yeah, I agree. And it's even too then prepping that candidate on, even if you're a client, if you're an operator and you do have a long interview process and you do, and that's just, it is what it is. And it's long. It's prepping the candidate too with, hey, this is going to be a journey. So buckle up.
Yeah, you got to set expectations for sure.
Well, especially if the candidate is passive, right? Maybe if they're unemployed or they're like able to stay the course for a long time. But if they're super passive and they don't necessarily need to change their job, it would be nice to maybe, but it's not like a, make it or break it situation. They could easily lose interest after interview 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and just be like, you know what, I'm out. I don't need this as much as I thought I needed this.
Yeah. So then is it something from the client's perspective? Because right now I want to talk about clients. I want to talk about the organizations that are interviewing these individuals that have these lengthy interview processes, or just interview processes in general, which everyone does. Should the organization be adjusting their interview process based on the candidate? You had talked about whether a candidate is passive. You talked about a candidate is unemployed. Do we feel like the interview process there should be a pivot at all with an unemployed candidate versus a very, very passive candidate?
I think yes, but also even then it's so competitive, right, out there anyways for hiring. So even if the candidate is unemployed, somebody else with a quicker interview process that's probably at it for the same amount of money, maybe similar salary or hourly wage, like that candidate's going to get picked up really quickly. So I think it's first one for the operator, speed to lead, right? How quickly are we getting in touch with the applicant? And even then, if you're using a search firm, how quickly are you jumping at that first interview when that search firm sends you the candidate? And I'm not saying like, oh, I've got time next week. It's like, no, let's do before hours, after hours, weekends. I've seen clients go, hey, are they open on a Saturday morning? Yes. They don't, first of all, have to dip out of work early, or they don't have to do it on their lunch from their car. They could be at home and focus on the interview. So that's ideal. But I think it's the two things. I think it's the speed to lead, and then it's how quickly we are scheduling that first step.
Yeah.
And if you're using a PI, send the PI right away. Don't wait. Get the details.
Yeah, I think you should always assume the candidates are actively interviewing. Even if this is somebody that was a referral that was given to you from somebody that's in-house. Hey, I worked with this person at my last company. They would be great for it. I don't know if they're even looking. Like, you call that person and assume that person's actively interviewing, because as soon as you have that conversation, that kind of flips the switch in the candidate's mind to say like, oh, if I am going to leave, who I should reach out to is this person at this other company and see maybe if they have any needs. Or maybe I'll just go on Indeed and just take a look around just so I know what my options are. As soon as you start that process, it's a snowball effect in the candidate's mind. And so I think whenever, you get a candidate submitted to a client and you don't hear back for 3 days, I mean, that to me says, okay, this is a client that either is not in touch with what the current market is as far as, being able to get a solid candidate and how difficult it is and how fast they're going, or this isn't a high priority search. This just isn't something that the need they're trying to get filled, which, I mean, either way is, I think, bears on having a conversation from the recruiter side. But I think being able to bring those passive candidates to the table, being able to make sure that they are kept engaged through the process, and so they know, like you were saying, they're prepared. Okay, this is going to be a longer process, or this is going to be a 3 or 4 stage interview process, and setting expectations. We should be hearing back by the end of the day tomorrow as far as how we want to move forward, or whatever that's going to look like. That really ensures that they feel like their hands being held through the process and they feel secure. Once they start having uncertainty, I thought I was going to hear by now and I haven't. Oh, you know what? I said this thing in that interview that maybe they didn't take the right way. And I should probably go look around and just make sure I'm covering my bases on my end. That insecurity on the candidate side, I think oftentimes from the client perspective, if we're just being intentional through the process, I think we're able to circumvent that and potentially circumvent them having other interviews that they're then, keeping in mind. And, oh, you know what? I've got an offer from this place I'm waiting to hear back from, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
There's 2 things you said. You said the urgency comment, which I couldn't agree more. How urgent actually is this search then, or this position? How is this vacancy in this position affecting your bottom line? If it's a sales director, it's probably really going to affect your bottom line. But for the other thing that you had mentioned was even for the candidate, they could be, as soon as they start the interview process, they're like, well, wait, I wonder what else is out there. And then it's the at nighttime glass of wine, sifting through Indeed, checking LinkedIn and just kind of like, oh, that company's hiring. I had no idea. Let me just pop my resume in there. And it kind of gets
Yeah.
their wheels spinning of, if I'm already thinking this position isn't a good fit for me and I'm interviewing with this other company, let me go see what else is out there. So I do think that that is definitely something, the competition wise, obviously every candidate that you talk to, you set an interview with, think that they're interviewing with others.
Yeah,
I think that's a good mentality to have.
I agree. The other thing that operators that are hiring need to consider is who's got the leverage. And I hate using the word leverage when we're talking about recruiting, but at the end of the day, it's reality.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times organizations think that just because that they're the ones that are hiring, they always have the leverage in terms of how the flow of things are going to go. And I say that when I say that, I mean, if you're hiring and you are doing everything you can to recruit passive candidates and you're working with a search firm, or you're just recruiting on your own and you're talking to the competitor down the street that is getting results, that is very passively interested in speaking with you and your team, it changes the game a little bit in terms of who's got the leverage, because you can't act like the candidate is just going to jump at your every move. You got to do a little bit of schmoozing. You got to do some recruiting. Because of that, the candidate might have the leverage in situations that cause for you to change your process in order to recruit a passive candidate. Now, a candidate that has applied to you 3 times and doesn't have a job that still we think can get results, maybe there's a little bit of a different dynamic, and maybe the operator has a leverage in that scenario. But I think a lot of times, a lot of clients don't like to stop and think, okay, based on this situation, who's got the leverage in terms of how this flow is going to go?
Well, you still have to recruit them. It doesn't
Yeah.
stop until they're literally hired. They start their first day of work, and then it flips to, how am I going to retain this person? So it's throughout the entire interview process of even sharing, oh, this is our benefits. You're still recruiting that person, and I need them to come and work for me. So how am I going to entice them and get them excited about the position or the company or the vision, whatever it might be? That's a very, really good point.
I think as much as you can be flexible, and sometimes it's just not a fit in the regard of just being able to pivot. There was a regional size operator I was working with one time for a VP role, and this is a candidate that was super strike zone for what they were looking for, and they were just so excited about them. And that candidate let me know that she had started an interview process after we'd started this process, and it had dragged out a little bit on our side. And so she said, okay, I've got an offer on the table, and they let me know I have until the end of the week. It was like a Tuesday, to be able to get an offer back to them. And I went to the client and said, I know you guys were looking to fly her out and do an in-person with the board next week. She's got a deadline. This is an opportunity that she's very interested in. Her preference is for you as a client side, but she's looking and needs to make a move. And they were like, well, yeah, unfortunately, that's the process. I was like, well, can we get all the same people on a Zoom? Is that an option? Can we, have, one person from the team fly out and sit down with her and, and do maybe like a Zoom and a one person in person? No, that's not the way it's going to work. We have to have her flown into the main office, and we have to have everybody meet her in person. It's like, okay, well, can we expedite that to happen before the end of this week? No, we can't do it. Okay, well, she's going to accept this other position. I mean, and if that's the way it has to be, that's the way it has to be. I mean, it's like you can't ask somebody to change a process that they have to answer to a board for, or investors, or however their company is going to be set up. But it does have a cost, and not having the flexibility there to pivot to say, okay, how can we creatively, think about a candidate we're really excited about for a high level role as a VP. How can we potentially make some changes to our process so that we can accommodate and see if this is somebody we really want to make an offer to?
Well, that's the flexibility piece that I think with flexibility when it comes to scheduling interviews is a huge miss. I had a client say, I only interview between 10 a.m. and noon on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Mm.
I'm sorry. These people are actively employed. Like, you're expecting
Yeah.
them to take an hour to an hour and a half out of their day to interview with you. Yes, they want the position, but again, they're super passive, so they don't necessarily need to go to a different position.
Mhm.
Would they like to? Yeah, but also this is part of the deal of being flexible and interviewing before work, after work. weekends, even whatever it might look like for those specific candidates. And I mean, something we do at least is ask the candidate, what is your availability like to interview? And we make sure the client, the operator, they know that up front of this candidate cannot interview during working hours. They've made it very clear that that is a no-go for them. And I think also too, regional VPs positions, they're also traveling. They're flying, they're in
Yeah.
different time zones sometimes. And so they're supporting their communities, right? So it's, being a little bit flexible operator side, but then also too candidate side. If it is a position that you really want and you are excited about it, you kind of got to give a little as well when it comes to being flexible and it's a delicate balance, I would say.
Yeah, I think it goes back to really just the leverage conversation that I was talking about. Like in your case, the example that you were giving, Katie, is someone who's actively employed and really there's no way that they can take time out of their day while they're working to interview. And in those scenarios, if you're a client and you're interested in the candidate, then like you got to do what you just mentioned. You got to do it before work. You got to do it after work. You got to be more flexible because you want to talk to the candidate, right? Candidate doesn't need the job, but you want to try and recruit them to come work for you. You got to kind of move and shake on your end. The other piece of that I do want to talk about is in those scenarios, I think it goes a long way if you're an operator and you tell the candidate that I'll interview in the morning, I'll interview during my lunch break, or I'll interview during the nighttime.
Mm-hmm.
And it just shows that recruiting is an art and a hunt and just a consistent pull. And it just shows your willingness to want to bring a candidate on. Candidates want to feel desired. And a lot of times, if an operator decides to move their schedule around to get in front of a candidate, it shows that they're desired and it makes them want to interview even more.
Yeah.
From the candidate's perspective, I think, yes, they're busy. But at the end of the day, like if they're interested in the opportunity, they need to figure out how to make themselves available. And I think a lot of times, a candidate can, let's say, interview during their lunchtime and they can go into their car and they can do an interview. Now, I know we don't want them to do that, but I think it goes a long way when a candidate says, hey, I can actually go do it on my lunch break. Unfortunately, I'll be in a car because it's the only setup, but I'm willing to do it then. And that just shows the candidate's willing to move their schedule around and try and make it happen. And then a lot of times an operator will realize that and say, gosh, they're willing to do it on their lunch in their car. I don't really want to do that. Maybe let's just schedule it for later tonight, kind of thing. So I think on both sides, it goes a long way.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It's kind of like dating, and I haven't dated in, 13 years or so. So it's been a long time, but it's kind of like dating, right? Like you want to be courted. You want to be chased a little bit. You want someone to feel like they
Yeah.
want you kind of deal. So
And both
I know I
parties have
think
to feel
that.
mutual interest. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Mutual interest. Mutual interest. I do have a question for you guys. Have ever clients asked you types of questions to ask during the interview process for specific positions? Hey, we're going to interview this candidate, but do you have any questions that you suggest we ask while we interview to get the most out of the interview?
That's a good question. Not off the top of my head. I mean, as far as what that would look like, I will communicate to clients things that I feel like they should touch on. So if there's something with a candidate where I'm like, okay, they said this and this, while I was speaking with them, they're qualified, it makes sense. I would want to make sure you guys address, these two things to make sure this is going to be a successful hire. So I will give them a few insights, in that regard that I just kind of volunteer.
Yeah. I've had it a couple of times. It was a really interesting process with the client talking to them about, well, what do you want from the interview? What are you hoping to gain? And they're like, okay, leadership skills. Okay, let's do scenario-based questions then. If this happened, how would you have reacted, right? And then even tangible skills, talking about, if we're going to talk about sales, for example, favorite topic, how are you getting that information from them that they are actually qualified, that they are actually doing the sales and those kinds of things. I think that asking the more open-ended questions and making it more of a conversation, first of all, alleviates pressure off of the candidate, but then also allows for that operator to get more of a personal insight on that individual. Yes, they can probably do the job. Great. But, is it a person that we want on our team for the long haul?
Yeah.
Deal. I was also talking to a different operator, and she said that they were redoing their interview process, and she pulled a lot from Chat GPT.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah,
knew
you know?
that would pique your interest.
Okay, so then in terms of interview process, as we're getting towards the end of the process, I think a lot of times operators tend to move a little bit slower towards the end of the process. And I mean, I know right now at our firm, we're in multiple situations where we have candidates towards the end of the process, but the operator is a little bit undecided in terms of what they want to do. And
Mhm.
I think a lot of times when you're dealing with passive candidates, that really makes it tough to close a candidate or to bring a candidate on if you end up wanting to bring them on if the end of the process is taking a long time. So question for the team here, and when they're in those scenarios and you know one of your clients is interested in a candidate but cannot make a decision, or has another candidate that has come into the process a little bit later in the game, therefore is causing some delays. I mean, what are we doing as recruiters to keep those candidates engaged? You know, a lot of times I sit there and I think like, well, you never want to lie to a candidate, right? You never want to lie to an operator. But at the end of the day, you know, a candidate is only human and they can only be waiting in the process for so long without realizing, okay, clearly there's someone else in the mix here. And clearly I'm not the leading candidate if they want to keep exploring the opportunity with this other candidate. So are we coming out and are we telling candidates, hey, there's someone else in this interview process, that's why it's taking a little bit longer? Are we just telling the candidate that, hey, there's some stuff that's happening in the background that's taking a little bit longer to try to buy some time? Like, what happens in those scenarios?
I am all about transparency is key. I think it also builds a little bit of competition for that candidate that's like, wait, there's somebody else, kind of deal. They're kind of like, wait, I want this. How can I get this position? And so I like to be transparent, but I'm also then equally very transparent back to the operator of, I think it's great that you like this other person so much, but we need to keep this other one engaged. Is there any steps in between, whether it be, let's talk about the benefits with them? Is there a phone conversation that we can set up where it's just kind of another little mini interview just to kind of keep the candidate going and engaged in the process as well? I think any of those types of things would be helpful for that person that feels like they aren't the front runner anymore. And if they're not the front runner and you're not going to hire them, cut them loose. Tell them
Sure.
you're
Yeah.
not going to hire them. Because if you continue to drag it out, first of all, it could do really big damage to the operator's reputation. Like, well, they just held on to me for 6 weeks and then decided not to hire me. Like that could feel really bad. And so then for future times when you have a position come up and you want to go back to that candidate, they might be like, I'm burned. I don't want to do it. So I think for the operator, at least, making sure to keep them engaged with that, whatever touch points that can be, providing feedback, letting them know there are other people in the mix, or if it's just simply things are tied up and we need to take a pause and, there's corporate leadership conversations, like there's just other things, like just tell the candidate, hey, we've got a lot of travel coming up over the next week. So, I mean, do you mind holding out?
Yeah.
Honesty is key.
For sure. I think, yeah, the communication and being able to have a sense of where things are at in the process. I mean, I really feel like that's where the value of having a good recruiter comes in, where it's someone that's able to have a confidential conversation with the candidate and not necessarily disclose anything that was said in detail, but to say, hey, I'm concerned we're losing this person. I mean, it's been 3 days since their last interview. We don't have a next step for them yet. And the last person they spoke to said an expectation that they were going to hear within 24 hours. And it's been 72. So they're wondering what's going on. So I think to your point, Katie, being able to pivot and potentially have a follow-up call just to be able to maintain engagement can be really helpful. I think just however you can kind of continue to take a temperature on somebody to make sure that you're not losing them in the process. If you are interested, if you're not interested, definitely I think you should cut that person loose. I think it's difficult from the candidate perspective because there is a lot of insecurities that go into an interview process. There's a lot of excitement and doubt. And it's similar to dating, like you were saying. I mean, it's like you feel like you're on the same page with somebody, and then something comes up, and you're like, oh well, I don't know how to read this. Maybe
Red
I should
flag.
just yeah, maybe I
Red
should just
flag.
jump ship. I think for candidates, my advice is to try to stay as humble as you can through the process and be as patient as you can. Like Gaston, you were mentioning earlier, sometimes there's more leverage from the candidate standpoint. Sometimes there's more leverage from the company standpoint. I mean, the company inherently is going to have a substantial amount of leverage because they're deciding, who's going to get an offer and how much it's going to be for. And so I think as a candidate, trying to be able to be patient and not take things personally through the process is going to go a long way. As being as flexible as you can, how responsive you are, how flexible you are in getting interviews scheduled. I think that provides a lot of equity in the process that you can then leverage down the road whenever it comes time to discuss an offer, because if you've been, a pleasant person to deal with through this whole process and easy to schedule and being available and just a favorable, candidate in the process and you're interviewing well, it's going to put you in a much better position than somebody where it's like, hey, like, are they even interested? They haven't gotten back to us in a couple of days. When they did get back to us, they gave us one time that they're available to interview and it's for next week. Like, do they even want this job? So I think for candidates, I think not to underestimate or overestimate what leverage they have in the process. I mean, because really it's going to depend on how desperate the company is for that particular position, and you never really know. And so I think always act as though, they have other options and act as though there's things that are going on that don't necessarily mean they're not interested in you. It's just a part of the process for that company. But at the same time, I think it's understandable, and being able to communicate that when you have concerns is really important. Hey guys, like, I haven't heard from anybody and I don't know what's going on for next steps. Do you have somebody else that's interviewing? I mean, do you have some like a lead candidate? And, I mean, just being able to have those conversations and try to be as transparent as you can, I think is really helpful. Nobody wants to feel like they're the last choice, but I think, being wise and sensitive about that on both the client side and the candidate side, because I've seen it blow up on both sides. I've seen, a candidate that's like, well, I feel like they're pushing me around at this point. They rescheduled on me twice, and it's like, well, I mean, you're supposed to be meeting with an SVP. Like, yeah, their schedule is crazy. Like, don't take it personally. It's not any kind of a statement about how they feel about you. It's just, it's challenging to get on this person's calendar. And same on the company side. I've seen people that have qualified candidates because they felt like, well, I'm not picking up that they really want this job. It's like, well, they're a passive candidate, I mean, so I think whenever ego starts to get involved, that is kind of a recipe for disaster through the interview process. But as long as everybody can try to stay as humble as possible and professional, work and expedite the process as much as you can to stay in pace with the market and other companies that they may be interviewing with. I mean, I think you're going to be in a good position.
Josh, one thing you had mentioned was the following the interview in terms of telling a candidate when the next interview steps are going to be. I think a lot of times operators just they shoot themselves in the foot because they tend to, I guess you call it overpromise and underdeliver in terms of what next steps are, and that can really put a bad taste in a candidate's mouth. So I think, there's this balance on the client side in terms of when next steps are. It's almost to the concept of when we talk about salary with candidates and why we try and stay away from giving a salary number, and we really try and keep it so that it's all about experience and interview, because we've seen salaries be way down here and we've seen them be way up here, and it's all relative, right? It's all based on certain dynamics. So I think, a lot of times next steps in interviews, there's that same concept where, you don't want to tell them tomorrow if it's not going to be tomorrow. And you don't want to tell them, I've got no idea when the next steps are, because that doesn't work either. So a lot of it's case by case. And I think if operators can keep it so that, you're not giving specifics, but you're giving a general estimation on when possible next steps are, but we'll keep the candidate updated. I think that helps.
Yeah. Yeah. And even an update could be a simple text of, hey, there is no update, but I just want to let you know I'm thinking of you. Like there is like, you can even just keep it as simple as that. Even if you don't have like, I don't have the calendar yet or the date and times yet from my regional, but I just want to let you know, we're thinking of you. You're top of mind. We're going to get this scheduled. Sometimes like no update is still an update, and I think that's that communication piece, constant communication. There's a few things that I feel like we've touched on from candidate and operator. And then I want to go into recruiter, but for candidate, it's like, be patient with the process, ask the questions of what is the process, right? Lay it out for me. How many interviews are we thinking? You know, what's the cadence going to look like so that you have a good idea in your mind as the candidate what this process is going to entail, and then be flexible for candidate, right?
Yeah.
And then for the operator, I feel like it's the same thing. Be flexible with the candidate and where they are, you know, whether it's unemployed or, you know, passively employed, like each candidate is going to be different in how you are connecting with them and scheduling next steps. You need to be flexible as an operator, and you need to give timely feedback. There's, you know, you can't wait a few days and go, okay, this is what I thought about the interview. You know, it's got to be pretty much top of mind. And that's why it's so important for us as recruiters to get that feedback right after the interview happens, because then you just like go on to your next thing, right? You just like quickly go into your next meeting or whatever, and you could completely forget how that interview went, right? So that feedback is pretty critical immediately following the interview.
So then to confirm there, what you were saying is timely feedback from the client to the recruiter that's helping you fill the role, or just, you know, whoever that next person is in the interview process. Or like, what are you referring to in terms of feedback?
I think feedback. So if you're interviewing, right? An operator is interviewing and maybe they're using a search firm. It would be feedback directly back to the whoever you're working with at that search firm, the recruiter. Now, if you're not using a search firm, and you know, it should be feedback right back to talent acquisition of green light or red light, you know, or next up, I want this to be dug in a little bit more detail, right? And I think that that part of that communication is so critical because, like I said, we go about our day, you know, and so I think it's important to, whether it's a pick up the phone. I have a client who will just text me, like, and he'll just say, she's a no for this reason, or she's a yes, but I want more information about this, you know, and he'll just fire off the text right away. And I'm like, okay, cool. Like, we already know, kind of thing. So I think that immediate feedback before the interviewer forgets, but also then for the person that is being interviewed, I would want feedback. I thrive on feedback. I ask for feedback. I feel like way too much, but I feel like even for that candidate to have feedback of, yes, they want to move forward, but we need to dive into XYZ in the next interview. So let's talk about that. And I think that for that person, then it's like, oh, okay, like it's almost honing into their own professional development and skills of how to interview too. You know, a lot of people don't interview at all sometimes. You know, like interviewing it feels a little weird and a little strange. So I think as much as we can as recruiters coach on that, it's helpful for them to eliminate the nerves.
So then, do we recommend operators giving individual feedback back to candidates that they're interviewing if they're going to be moving forward in the process? Meaning, you know, an executive director interviews a sales director and the ED likes the sales director, and next step is an interview with the regional sales director. Do we recommend the ED reaching out to that candidate and giving constructive feedback on the interview process, or is that not a practice that we would recommend?
If you're not using a search firm, I think you should do that. If you are using a search firm, use the recruiter to do that.
Okay.
I just think, you know, for me, even I'll never forget it when I was interviewing for an operator up in the Bay. And I actually asked after the interview, and she's like, okay, well, we'll be in touch with next steps. And I'm like, okay, so is there anything that I could have done differently, or is there anything that you still need clarity on before the next interview? And I think back to that, and she like kind of looked at me like surprised almost that I was asking for feedback. And, you know, and she kind of looked at me and she was like, well, I think for the next interview, you're going to want to talk more about your outreach skills. I'm like, okay, I can do that.
Yeah.
You know, like, and it kind of gave me an opportunity to be like, okay, so this is what's also important to them. Not only can, you sell, but like, can you also go out and market?
Yeah.
So
then as we round this process out in terms of interviews, I want us to just take a step back and put ourselves in the candidate shoes. And for all the candidates that are future candidates that are possibly listening to this, if they're ever in the situation where they've made it through the interview process and they know a decision is going to be made and the decision hasn't been made yet, and there's been no offer made, but they know there's no more steps in this process. Just human nature, if you want the job, to consistently ask the question, well, am I going to get an offer? Is an offer coming? Am I going to get selected? And I think a lot of times candidates, even working through recruiters and even not working through recruiters, are sitting there in their mind trying to have this dance of, well, do I call the client? Do I call the recruiter? Do I send a text? Do I send an email? Do I send a LinkedIn message asking, like, how do I, we talk about moving the process forward, like, how do I kind of nudge the client and move the process forward a little bit without seeming desperate? And I think, from that perspective, like, what do we recommend for candidates? Is it case by case? Do we recommend them picking up the phone and calling the person who they just interviewed with saying, hey, I haven't heard from anyone in a week? I mean, what do we recommend if we're a candidate that is at that stage in the process?
I mean, I think it depends on how wise you've been through the interview process to start. So I always recommend for candidates to write thank you notes, no matter what the position is. Write a
Yes.
short thank you note, something that's going to be, two sentences. Hey, so and so, really enjoyed the opportunity to sit down and meet with you. Really and appreciate this that you shared. Looking forward to next steps. Something like that. Super, super simple. Don't go into a whole thing. Nobody's got time. But you've established communication in that regard. And so then if you're not working through a recruiter and you're just interviewing with that company, you can go to whoever was on that calendar invite that you received for the initial interview and say, okay, like, this is that executive that I spoke with. Here's my thank you note. It's been 3 days. I haven't heard back. Hey, Mr. Executive, just following up, really interested in the opportunity. Do you have any thoughts or feedback on how we'd be moving forward? If not, do you have any creative criticism for me that I can take in my next interview process? And that lets them know, hey, I'm professional. I'm respecting your time. I'm not being, super clingy, but at the same time, like, what's going on? Most likely that's the person that's going to be able to move the ball forward. If you only have access to talent acquisition, they're going to be subject to that executive. And so they're not going to have as much control in the process or ability to get that move forward. But whoever you have access to, that's who you have access to, and that's who you should reach out to. It's a lot easier to do a follow-up asking for an update after you've sent a thank you note versus I haven't established any communication. Hey, what's an update? What's going on?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think, get into the practice of sending thank you notes within, 3 or 4 hours after the interview, and then you're in a good position.
Definitely agree with the thank you notes. I'm huge on those. Gaston got at the office, a thank you note for somebody that I actually screened and talked to on the phone and submitted to a job. And she mailed a thank you note to the office.
Wow.
I know.
She even did her own artwork on it.
Yeah. Yeah. She's a wonderful lady. But anyways, so the other thing too, that I know I keep bringing it back to dating, but also to you, Gaston, you said, like, how much follow-up is too much follow-up. I feel like if you feel like you are being a little too much, a little too clingy, a little too, pushy, then you're being too pushy. Like, use your best adult judgment in how much follow-up is too much follow-up. But I also think too, I really like it when candidates follow up in the interview process. If I have to go and chase you, then that tells me that you're really probably not that into it. But if you're coming and you're chasing me, that means you have the fire in your belly. You want this. And so I think even for operators too, for us, when it's as recruiters, when it's been a few days and we haven't heard from anybody of the next steps, and we're, hey, what is the next step? We need to move this candidate forward, and we're doing like more of that follow-up. It's better than almost the candidate doing the follow-up and potentially, like, damaging a relationship there.
So you're
right?
saying
Like,
recruiters do the dirty work, huh?
Recruiters do the dirty work, yes.
Yeah.
But that kind of brings me to my next little point with using a recruiter or having a search firm be part of this process. We, with the client that used to do 9 interviews, they no longer do 9 interviews, but we worked with them and kind of coached them through, here's how we can trim this, because this is feeling very redundant. And it was almost to the point where they were interviewing the exact same VP or regional 2 times. It's like, what did we not get out of that first time that we could have eliminated that second conversation? And so, it has drastically impacted their recruitment and how quickly they then go to interviewing, to hiring, to start date. It's like apples and oranges at this point. So evaluate your recruiting process. And if you need help evaluating your recruiter process or your interviewing process, the three of us are more than happy to do that with you.
Awesome.
For sure.
Shameless plug.
Well, this was fun.
This was really fun. I feel like we nailed a lot of the interview process. I guess the next would be making the offer.
Yeah, hold on.
Yeah. Gaston's got an offer right now.
I actually do have an offer, but that's fine.
Oh, his computer's dying.
Yeah.
Shocker. This was fun though. Okay, so then next time, we talked about the interview process, but then what happens after you find your unicorn candidate and you are ready to make an offer and seal the deal? What happens next? So we'd love to connect with you about that at another episode. But for now, I guess take a look at your interview process, think about it from the candidate side, the operator side, and also the recruiter side. And I guess, yeah, if you need help with your interview process, we're here.
See you guys.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.
The peace sign.